Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you to the School of Law for inviting me here today. It's a particular pleasure for two reasons. Firstly, it's always really special and a great honour to be invited as a psychologist to a law conference. So thank you for having me here to give a slightly different perspective to the day. And also, on a non-academic note, I'm just thrilled to be in the west of Ireland because I've been wanting to come here for years and years, and for one reason or another haven't quite made it. So when Brian got in touch, then I thought, well, now I really am going to get there. So it's lovely to be here. Thank you very much. So today I'm going to concentrate on our research on surrogacy. As Brian said, the Centre for Family Research in Cambridge studies all kinds of new family forms, but the topic of today is surrogacy, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So as will be discussed throughout the day, there are a number of ethical, moral, and legal issues related to surrogacy that have been the focus of some concern, such as the potential for commodification of children and the exploitation of surrogate mothers. But what I want to focus on particularly today is the potential for psychological harm to children who are born through a surrogacy arrangement. And specifically, the psychological effects of being born to a woman who has conceived them with the deliberate intention of relinquishing them to other parents, and to really look at what that might mean for children, and particularly when the surrogate may be the genetic mother of the child, and also the other area of great concern when money has changed hands in order for this arrangement to take place. So the research I'm going to talk about really focuses on the question of what actually happens to children born through surrogacy. There's been a huge amount of speculation about these children, a great deal of assumption made about what will happen to them, usually viewed as being negative. So the research that we've been carrying out has really tried to provide some empirical data to feed into discussions about surrogacy, so that there's some information about the lives of these children and their families, rather than simply people thinking that certain things might happen. So the main study I'm going to talk about is a longitudinal study of surrogacy families. This is a study we've been carrying out since the year 2000, so the children are now turning 16. I also want to speak a little bit about surrogate mothers and talk about some research carried out by my colleague Vasanti Jadva and Susan Imrie, who've carried out a longitudinal study of surrogate mothers, and also just finally to mention a new study that we've been carrying out in the United States of gay father families formed through surrogacy. That's not finished yet, so I won't have any results. So what are the concerns about surrogacy when you think about the family? Well, there have been a number. Firstly, it's been argued that if a woman has a child through surrogacy, then there's no opportunity for prenatal bonding with the child because somebody else is pregnant with the child. Of course, this is also true of adoption. I think it's important to bear that in mind. Another concern relates to the involvement of a third party in creating the family, and the thought that this might in some way undermine parenting, and particularly in cases where the surrogate remains in contact with the child as the child grows up. How might that affect parents' feelings of entitlement to parent the child? Might it perhaps undermine how confident mothers feel in their mothering role, and particularly perhaps if the surrogate is the genetic mother of the child? Another issue is the attitudes of the wider family and the social community in which the family resides. Surrogacy, as you all know, is controversial. Many people feel very strongly that this is something rather immoral. And so couples who think of having children in this way, because surrogacy can't be hidden, of course, there's no pregnancy, they have to explain the arrival of the child, they must deal with the negative attitudes of others. And the most important question of all, how do children feel about being conceived by a woman who is intending, or did intend and did, relinquish them to the other parents? And again, as I said before, might these feelings be more complicated and perhaps more distressing for children in cases of the surrogate being paid to have the pregnancy, and also if it's the surrogate who is their genetic mother. So with these questions at the back of our mind, we set out to carry out a study of 42 surrogacy families. And these were, as I said, recruited in the year 2000 at the time of the millennium. And we were fortunate in that the Office of National Statistics in the UK agreed to work with us. And whenever a surrogate couple become the legal parents of a child when they have a parental order, this is recorded with the Office of National Statistics. And therefore, we were able to approach practically all of the families in the UK at the time with a child aged around 1 year old. And we had a pretty good response rate of around 70%, 72%. So we also, and then there were a few who hadn't yet been given parental orders, and we managed to contact those through the only surrogacy agency at the time, COTS. And so altogether, it wasn't possible to work out an exact response rate, but it was somewhere in probably about the mid to high 60%. So we don't have a total population of surrogacy families, but considering this is such a hard to reach population, then actually it's a pretty good response rate. They certainly weren't people just volunteering for the study. We compared the surrogacy families with two other groups of families. Firstly, a group of egg donation families, and that was to control for the involvement of a third party in the child's conception, and also 18 natural conception families who were matched as closely as possible to the surrogacy and egg donation families on demographic characteristics. Among our surrogacy families, 38% had used gestational surrogacy. That means the social parents, the intended parents, were the genetic parents of the child. And 62% had used genetic surrogacy, so the surrogate mother was the genetic parent. And another distinction was between surrogates who were known to the family and those who were unknown. So 31% were known, so they were relatives or close friends. 69% had been previously unknown. So in addressing the questions about what happens to children born through surrogacy, we were interested in different aspects of family relationships. So really our main questions were, do surrogacy families differ from either egg donation families or natural conception families in relation to the psychological well-being of the parents, which we know is an important indicator of children's well-being. We also were particularly interested in the quality of relationships between the parents and their children. When I talk about parents, I mean the social parents who are bringing the child up. And also the psychological well-being and adjustment of the children. And in particular, how the children themselves feel about being born through surrogacy. There were also some additional questions that we addressed along the way. So how did parents tell or talk to children about surrogacy? And also, how did the relationship with the surrogate mother turn out over time? Because often people assume that this is going to be a very difficult relationship that will break down. So we were interested over the years in how that relationship developed. So that's a great advantage of longitudinal research. This is actually the only longitudinal study of surrogacy families in the world. So I think probably because longitudinal research is difficult to do, but of course it gives you so much more than a kind of cross-sectional snapshot of what's going on. So, now the sample sizes in this study were not large. However, the assessments were very in-depth. So researchers travelled out to family homes all over the UK. They administered very in-depth interviews designed to assess quality of parenting, quality of parent-child relationships. They carried out observational assessments of parent-child interaction, which gives you a more fine-tuned assessment of the relationship between each parent and the child. And also standardized questionnaires. We obtained data from mothers, from fathers, from the children themselves as they grew up, and also to get an independent report from the children's teachers. We visited the families when the children were 1, 2, and 3 years of age. We then saw them again in middle childhood when they were 7 and 10, and then most recently we saw them once they had made the transition into adolescence at age 14. So I just want to summarize our findings of going through the years, and happy to answer more detailed questions at the end. So in comparing the surrogacy families with the natural conception families, and most of my results I'm going to present are to do with this, because actually it turned out the egg donation and surrogacy families were very similar throughout the course of the children's development. On most counts, but I'll tell you where there were differences. So, age 1, so when the child was 1, where there were differences between the surrogacy families and the natural conception families, the surrogacy families turned out to be doing better. So mothers and fathers reported less stress associated with parenting. The mothers showed lower levels of depression. The fathers were more satisfied with their role as a parent. The mothers and fathers, based on our standardized interview assessment of parenting, showed higher levels of warmth and sensitivity towards their infants, and also greater enjoyment of parenting, and also higher levels of emotional involvement with their infants. With the infants, we looked at their temperament through parent assessments, and we found no differences in infant temperament between children or infants in the different family types. At age 2, we used a slightly different interview measure that was designed to look more closely, or we get under the surface of the emotional bond between the mother and her child. Again, more positive outcomes were found for the surrogacy mothers. They were rated as showing greater pleasure in their children, lower levels of anger, guilt, and disappointment. The fathers, again, showed less stress at age 2. In terms of the adjustment of the toddlers, the children didn't differ in terms of either their socio-emotional well-being development or their cognitive development. At age 3, so that was the last of our preschool assessments, again, where there were differences, they reflected more positive outcomes for the surrogacy families. We then had a gap to age 7, and age 7 is a particularly interesting time in terms of children's development as far as this issue is concerned, because it's really around age 6, age 7. By age 7, children have developed a much more sophisticated understanding of, firstly, biological inheritance, what that means. They're able to explain it more clearly. But also, they understand more about the meaning of the absence of a biological connection to parents. So for adopted children, for example, it's by around age 7 that they really understand that adoption, what it really means, and it's not just that, they were born from another mummy's tummy or however it's explained to them, but they understand by age 7 about the loss and perhaps being relinquished by their birth family, who were their genetic parents, and so on. So age 7 is a really kind of crucial age in terms of surrogacy, because there are many parallels in terms of the absence of gestational and sometimes also genetic links between mothers and their children. So what did we find? Firstly, not surprisingly, almost all parents had told their children about their surrogacy origins. In fact, we were surprised that not all had. It was about 90%. But what was interesting is that most of the parents who'd used genetic surrogacy had talked about the surrogacy, talked about the child being born to another woman, but hadn't said that this other woman was actually their genetic mother. And by age 10, almost half of the parents still hadn't done so. So that these children were growing up unaware that the surrogate was also their genetic mother. And one mother described it like this. She said, "We made it like bread in the oven. She just kept you warm until you were ready to come out. So no, it hasn't come up that biologically she's not mine." So that was quite a common finding. Now, in terms of the relationship between mothers and their children at age 7, then the surrogacy mothers were no longer showing higher levels of positive or parent-child relationships, but they weren't any different from the natural conception families or from the egg donation families at age 7. So the kind of more involved parenting that you saw in the preschool years was no longer apparent. And again, in the observational assessment of mother-child interaction, there was no difference between family types. And they were still seen as very well-functioning families. However, at age 7, there was a difference for the surrogacy children. So at age 7, we saw that these children showed significantly higher levels of psychological adjustment problems, emotional behavioral problems, than both the egg donation and the natural conception children. Now, one really important thing to say about this, because people have really latched onto this finding, people who are against surrogacy and have used this finding to say, surrogacy children have got psychological problems. This is absolutely not the case, because the children were functioning well within the normal range. So these weren't children who were showing clinical levels of problems, not by any means. But they were showing higher levels of problems than our comparison groups of children. So they hadn't until that time, but we did see it at age 7. And this was really interesting, because I think our inclination would have been, well, perhaps this isn't terribly meaningful, except that you see exactly the same thing with internationally adopted children. So that around age 7, so for example, there's been a big study of internationally adopted children in the Netherlands, exactly the same finding, raised levels of problems around age 7, which adoption researchers have attributed to children having to deal with identity issues earlier than other children. So particularly for internationally adopted children, it's very obvious that they're adopted because they look different from their parents. People ask them about this, they have to explain and this kind of thing. So it does seem to be around age 7 that children understand this more, and that it does in adopted children result in raised level of problems. And it seems to me that it's likely that it's a very similar mechanism going on with surrogacy children, because they know they were born through surrogacy. The surrogacy often is in touch with them. People are also aware of it and ask them about it. So I think that is the most likely explanation for this finding. But interestingly, by age 10, this had disappeared. So the children by age 10 had gone back to the same level of adjustment as the other children. And also interestingly, with the adopted children, particularly this large Dutch study, the same thing had happened. They were next seen at early adolescence, and again, they'd returned to the same level of functioning as the comparison group. So, this is the only study. We don't know whether it's a chance effect or not, but theoretically, it seems to make sense. So I think it is something that may be a real phenomenon with children born through surrogacy, just as it is with adopted children. So most recently, we have seen the families at adolescence. And of course, adolescence is a particularly interesting time in terms of children's development generally. It's a time when They become most concerned with issues of identity, who they are. They are more concerned about autonomy, of breaking free from their parents. And it's a time when difficulties in the relationships with parents are more likely to arise because of children trying to become more autonomous, and parents reacting against that, so there's more conflict at this time. So it seemed that with surrogacy children, that adolescents might present particular challenges in terms of their identity and in terms of their adjustment. And also, just as it does for adoptive parents, present particular challenges in terms of conflict with their child, and also the time at which adopted children become more interested in being adopted and wanting to find out more about that. The same may be true in surrogacy. So we went back to see the families, again with a very in-depth assessment, and rather pleasingly, the cooperation rate, the retention rate in the study has been very high. So when we lost people, it tended to be at the beginning, but between age 7 and age 10, it was almost all took part at both time periods, and also at age 14, we lost very, very few families. And what was really interesting and somewhat surprising to us in some ways was we actually found more positive relationships between mothers and their 14-year-olds in surrogacy families than in the other family types. And what was interesting about this in particular is that this came not just from ratings by the mother, but also from ratings given to from the adolescents, so that both the mothers were reporting this and the adolescents independently, which of course gives much more weight to the findings. I won't go into the measures, but as I say, I'm happy to discuss them later. And the adolescents themselves seemed to be functioning well. They weren't doing any better or any worse than the others, the other two groups, but they were functioning well. So that's where we are at the moment, at age 14. I want to say a little bit about the relationship with the surrogate up until this point. So in spite of this being something that people worry about, that this will turn out to be a very difficult relationship, in fact, when we tracked this up to age 10, the parents generally reported a positive relationship with the surrogate. As the child grew up, they began to see less of the surrogate or have less contact. But in fact, 60% of our families were still in touch with the surrogate by the time the children were 10 years old. So that's quite a lot. Now, by being in touch, it wasn't, sometimes it was just exchange of cards or emails, or we'd see each other once a year. It wasn't constant touch, but they were still in touch, and they did visit. Those who were most likely to have lost contact with the surrogate were if they had used a previously unknown genetic surrogate. Now, by the time children were 7, we were able to ask them themselves what they thought about their families. And we interviewed them at age 7 and age 10. Most of them who were in contact with their surrogate said positive things about her. They described her as nice, as kind. 2/3 of her, interestingly, wanted to see her more often. The rest felt it was about right, and one child wished to see less of their surrogate. So, in fact, the majority of children at age 7 and age 10 felt either indifferent or just quite neutral about their surrogacy origins. And some of them also talked about their relationship to the surrogate's own children and had some understanding of that, but others didn't. So the kinds of things children said to us at age 7 and 10, one child said she was really kind about, like carrying me in her tummy. Another said, I think she's kind and she's lovely and funny. Another child said, I feel fine, I don't feel bad or cross in any way. It's just pretty much nature, so I can't do anything about it. I wouldn't like to do anything about it. Now, more recently, we've seen the children at age 7 and again asked them how they feel now that they're teenagers. And most of them, I know teenagers are generally don't say a great deal, and the general impression, is not bothered was sort of the main message that came over, which actually is quite typical of teenagers about all kinds of things. But just to give you an example of the kinds of things they said to us. So one said, I don't really mind, it doesn't really affect my daily life. Another said, fine, just normal. I know it's different, but I don't get emotional or anything. It's just like talking about anything else. Another one said, I don't really care, to be honest. Another one said, I felt special and quite privileged, really. And another one said, I quite like talking about it because it's an interesting fact about me. Now, underneath all of this being not bothered, there is certainly interest in the surrogate, and there is interest in what this means for them. This is very recent data, and some of the researchers are doing more qualitative analysis on what the young people said to us at the moment. So I think actually it's a bit more complicated than just simply not bothered, but certainly on the surface, this is what they say when we ask them. Now, I just want to say a little bit about the limitations about this research. Firstly, it's a modest sample size. At the time, there were only about 40 surrogacies a year in the UK. It's gone up quite a bit since then. And we were sampling, over a certain time period and just trying to find as many families as we could. Because we didn't get every single family in the UK, then it's of course possible that there's a bias towards those who did take part, in that they could perhaps be the families who were most comfortable about surrogacy and about speaking about it. We have lost families over time, but between infancy and age 14, we still have about 80% of families in the study, which is pretty good over a 14-year period. And when we look at those who dropped out versus those who stayed in, they don't seem to differ on any important characteristics. The strengths of the study, well, as I said before, we have data on these families. We've followed up the children from infancy and so far to adolescence, so it paints a much clearer picture than just looking cross-sectionally. And the measures, which I haven't gone into, but they're very in-depth, they're multi-method, multi-informant. So generally, these seem, from this single study, like well-functioning families with loving, committed parents. We also see that surrogacy isn't undertaken lightly, and these are really quite unique couples who are willing to take a third party into their family in order to have a child. And as you've seen, that many actually stay in contact with this person as the child grows up. The children generally seem to be doing fine, but it is the first study, it's the only study, and of course it really needs to be replicated, and also the children followed up to later adolescence and beyond. Can I just ask how much time I've got before I...
For about 8 minutes.
8 minutes, that's fine, thank you. Okay, so I'd like to say now a little bit about surrogate mothers. So again, there are lots of ethical issues that I'm sure will be discussed later today, but some of them are, is the surrogate in a position to give truly informed consent? Do surrogates regret handing over the baby? Do they experience psychological problems themselves once they've handed over the baby or later on in their lives? And what is the impact on the surrogate's own family, including not just her husband or partner, but also her own children? So, a study of surrogates on average 10 years after having a surrogacy child was carried out by Vasanti Jadva and Susan Imrie in the Centre for Family Research. And they studied 34 surrogate mothers and 36 of their children, which represented about half of the children that these mothers had. And they were interviewed between 5 and 15 years after the birth, but on average 10 years later. Some of these, about 20 of them, were actually the surrogates to the families in the longitudinal study I've just mentioned. So what they found from the surrogates' accounts also, that they had kept in touch with the families and generally saw them once or twice a year and generally got on well. So that was really good validation that it wasn't just the parents trying to present a positive picture, but the surrogates were saying the same thing. Almost half of the surrogates' own children were in contact with the child their mother had had as part of a surrogacy arrangement. And interestingly, there wasn't a clear pattern in how they saw this relationship. So some of them, the children of the surrogate, saw the surrogacy child as a half-sibling. Some described when they were at school and having to do family trees and so on, they do a little bit of their family tree, a little leg off to the family their mother had had a child for. Others didn't see them in the same way, but they would, some just were interested, so would sometimes see them, but didn't feel particularly close to or attached to them. They also, some of them developed their own terminology for this half-sibling. So some called, surrosister was one that happened a couple of times, or tummy sister. So the children, because there weren't really any terms to describe it, the children would make up their own terms. So the children that we spoke to generally felt positive about what their mother had done and often very proud of their mother. So just to give you a couple of quotes, because we also, as I said, interviewed the children of the surrogate. So this child said, "I think it's a really nice thing to do for someone. Obviously, if they can't have children and they really want a child, that's a bad thing. So if someone else is able to do that for you and help you through it, then it's something that's compassionate, really." And another child said, "I think it's amazing. It's quite, I don't know, it's difficult for a woman to give away a child that she's given birth to. And I just think it's fantastic that my mum can and make people so happy." So, obviously I've just picked out a couple of quotes and we did only see half of the children. So I'm not trying to say that it was always wonderful, but on the other hand, we know that in some cases, really, the children of the surrogates seem to be quite happy and sometimes proud of what their mums have done. So none of the surrogates that Vasanti and Sue spoke to regretted being a surrogate. And as I've already said, many maintained a positive relationship with the family. It seems from what we know so far, the children of the surrogates actually seem quite accepting. But again, this is the first study of its kind, and really, we do need much more research on this topic. I've just got one slide about this last study. I just wanted to mention it because I find it quite an exciting study, because I'm generally interested in the effects of non-traditional families on children of various sorts. And this is the most non-traditional family that we've studied. So these are children born by surrogacy to gay fathers who have used a surrogate mother and a separate egg donor. This study was carried out in the US, I should have to say, because there aren't so many such families in the UK. So these children have got two fathers. One is a genetic father, the other is not, and two mothers, in that they have a surrogate, who's their gestational mother, and an egg donor, who's their genetic mother, but no mother living in the family home. We just completed data collection for this study, so we've recruited 40 gay father families with two-parent gay father families, and 55 lesbian mother families, and we're just about to begin to analyse the data. So from what we know so far from empirical research, it seems that many of the fears expressed about the psychological consequences of surrogacy seem to be based on speculation rather than fact. And the findings of empirical research really point to positive family relationships and well-adjusted children, which really is contrary to what generally people think is going to happen. But as a psychologist, I find that perhaps it's not as surprising as it may seem, because partly from this research, but from more general the more general literature on children in new family forms, we're finding more and more that the evidence is pointing to the fact that family structure is less important for children's psychological adjustment than is the quality of family relationships. Or put another way, positive family relationships matter more than whether children have a genetic and or gestational link with their parents. So perhaps the explanation is a rather simple one, that these are very wanted children whose parents went to great lengths to have them, and perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised after all. So that's really all I want to say at the moment. I just want to thank all the researchers, who are too many to name at the moment, to have helped with this study over the years. The research was funded by the Wellcome Trust, the US National Institutes for Health, and the ESRC in the UK. And this work, if anybody's interested in finding out more of the detail, all of the studies I mentioned, plus others on different kinds of new family forms, are summarized in my recent book, Modern Families. Thank you very much.